Welcome back. Well, let's stay with those floods. If this is said to be Georgia's worst flood in decades, what does it say about climate change in the Southern Cape region, especially as some areas have struggled with drought conditions in recent years? Well, Dr. Peter Johnston is a climate scientist at the University of Cape Town, and he's live with us now to offer his critical insight. Thank you so much for your time this morning. What does your data tell you about climate patterns in the Southern Cape?
Well, eNCA, it's complicated to say the least. One thing we are fairly certain about is the temperatures are increasing worldwide, and especially in southern Africa. We're seeing historical temperature increases and we're seeing projected temperature increases, and we are fairly certain about those. When it comes to rainfall, though, the uncertainty increases dramatically because the spatial connection that rainfall makes with temperature is never clear. So what we're seeing is not necessarily increased rainfall on an annual basis or on a decadal basis or even in the long term. What we are seeing is the more frequent occurrence of extreme events. Now, this has got to do with a more energetic atmosphere, and I can show you plenty of maps that are showing this increased rainfall. The energetic atmosphere means that even from the equator, where our moisture and our condensation is sourced, the movement and the energy of the systems, the convective systems, which means air is rising, containing water, and that water cools and then it rains, these are becoming stronger. So while we can't put a finger on what exactly is going to be happening in George, because even our projections didn't say that there was going to be this much rain on George, most of the forecasts said it would be offshore, and very often the rainfall does fall offshore and then nobody notices. So when it happens in an area that is built up and populated, it becomes very, very critical to be able to predict those, and we can't do that in the long term. What we can say is that a more energetic atmosphere, while it doesn't lead possibly to more rainfall overall, it is going to lead to more extreme events, and one of those extreme events is heavy rainfall days.
Peter, talking about extreme events, are they an indicator to Trumpian sort of naysayers regarding climate change that we are in fact heading towards some sort of crisis in terms of weather patterns changing?
And we're already in a crisis, and that is because the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are at levels that we've never ever seen before, and not in human history, not in scientific history. None of the records show us these levels that are so high. So that puts us on new ground. What we don't know is whether or not these levels are going to flatten off in the near future or in the far future. The current trajectory shows that by 2050, we are not likely to have reduced our emissions by much. And you must remember that emissions are caused by people, and there are more and more people. And those people are wanting a higher standard of living. So even if we individually cut down our emissions, the total number of emissions is unlikely to drop off. And that's going to have long-lasting effects on the temperature. Now, some people who deny that this is human or anthropogenic, as we call it, they are just deluded. There's no question about it. The science is very, very clear. We've got 99.9% of scientists supporting this. The evidence is clear. It's come out in the 6th assessment report once again. This is now the 6th consecutive report that is saying humans are to blame. It's saying the temperatures are unlikely to stay below the 1.5 degree threshold, and this is going to lead to unprecedented extreme events, events that we haven't seen on the scale and the frequency that we've never expected and never seen before.
Peter, when you talk about extreme events, I think of earthquakes and tsunamis. Are we talking that extreme?
No, Annika, you must understand, we're talking from a climate point of view. So we're talking rainfall and temperature-associated events. Now, that might be very hot days, it might be very wet days, it might be an excessive number of droughts, it might be flooding. And remember that the George flood, the rainfall wasn't so much the problem, it was the runoff that was the problem, and the runoff was exacerbated by the fact that the ground was very dry and there was very little vegetation. So the runoff was massive and people weren't prepared for that sort of runoff. So when I'm talking about extreme events, I'm talking about climatological things which originate in the temperature and the rainfall changes. So there might be derivatives of that. As I said, very hot days, extreme rainfall, dry periods, wet spells, and so on.
Peter, last question. Can local authorities afford to ignore some of the forecasts that are coming out with the data that you're seeing, and how can they prepare a little better?
Well, there are really two questions that we always pose to people who may be affected. The first one is, where are your vulnerabilities? are you vulnerable to high temperatures? Are you vulnerable to extreme rainfall? And when you look at those vulnerabilities, you look at two things. One is the extent of the danger. In other words, if for example, we've had 200 millimeters in George. If that happens again, how exposed are you? And it's the exposure and the vulnerability and the risk of the hazard that combine to show you your vulnerability. And once you've identified where you are vulnerable, then your response strategy is to make sure that you're ready for similar events if they happen again in the future. Whether that means changing your infrastructure, building bigger culverts under the roads, making your population more resilient, that's up to the local municipality to decide, because every single municipality has different vulnerabilities, different risks that they face.
Well, I hope that they're consulting with you, Peter. That was Peter Johnston, a climate scientist at the University of Cape Town. Thank you so much again for your insight and time.